me today to talk about copywriting and storytelling. My name's Nicole Richards. I am the Chief Storyteller at Philanthropy Australia, which is the peak body for giving in this country. So a little explanation, I've been telling stories in the social sector for a bit over a decade now. And while I believe that there are some things that you can do to have more impact with your stories, I'm by no way suggesting that there is a method or a formula that will guarantee you success. But, some people think that storytelling can be a very torturous business, or particularly writing the stories and finding the words to tell those stories. But I would suggest to you, with a little bit of homework and a bit of forethought beforehand, it's not necessarily the case. So everybody is a storyteller. We tell stories every day to our friends, to our family, to our colleagues, to ourselves. So let's get started with my top 5 in how to tell a great story that's going to have impact and achieve what you need it to do. So the first tip that I have for you is knowing what you need your story to do. When you have a sense of the purpose, that's going to help shape and inform not only how you tell your story, but where you place it, even the sorts of interview questions you ask, so that you get the content you need to make your story as compelling as possible. So ask yourself, why are you writing this particular story? Is it because you're trying to raise awareness of your organization and your work with a new audience? Are you trying to put out a very strong call to action for your existing support base? Or are you responding to an information gap that you've identified? When you have the answer to that, that's your touchstone for coming back to make sure that your story is on track while you're writing it, while you're gathering your material, and then before you're ready to distribute it. So what kind of response do you want from the people who are going to read your story? When we talk about response, probably one of the biggest things, particularly when you're talking about the social sector stories, is how do you want people to feel after they've read your story? Are you looking for them to be so moved that they're going to share it on social media? Or do you want them, simply to click a button? So again, thinking about that purpose and the response is so critical to knowing whether or not your story is on track or wildly off track, or whether it needs an overhaul. When you have that knowledge, you're going to be able to go into the interview with the sorts of questions you need to ask of your subject. So sometimes that will be, tell me a little bit about how your experience with our project, or with your lived experience in your local community, how did that make you feel? Feelings, because we're talking about humans here, stories connect people, so you need to have the human factor. We're going to touch on that a little bit later. But find the feeling, because when you can pull those words through from the person you're interviewing, that first-hand kind of narrative is a really, really powerful driver that can set up your story to really hit the target. So the number 2 storytelling tip when it comes to copywriting is know your audience. And this is something that's so critical in terms of how you're going to frame your story, the words you're going to use to tell that story. Because if you don't know who it is that you're writing for, you're kind of just throwing words out there in the dark. I know that there are some people, when they're telling stories, when they're actually writing them, that will either have a picture or a thought in their mind of their grandmother or of somebody that they've worked with in their field of work who they are particularly writing for them, and they find that very helpful. And again, I'm just going to keep driving home the human connection. You're not writing for a computer screen. You're not writing for a mass audience, a faceless audience, that has no feelings. Think about who it is that you'll be writing for. If you need to picture them and keep that face in your mind while you're writing, that can be a really powerful way of staying on track. So when it comes to knowing your audience, the preliminary question is, are they the right people? Do you know how to reach them? Where do they usually consume their stories? What do they read? Are you going to be completely misguided if you put this out online rather than, putting out something in a hard copy newsletter or publication or a mass media outlet. These are questions to think about beforehand, again, because it's going to shape the length of your story, the tone of your story, the way you pitch your story, all these kind of things. So if you've put the thought in beforehand, you could save yourself a bit of trauma at the end if you find out that you don't have the right story for the right fit, for the right audience. The other thing to think about, again, is what motivates them. There could be with a particular audience a key set of triggers, maybe that is parents, so they're thinking about their kids. There could be some really strong hooks or angles that you can just think about and how you might weave them into your narrative when you're telling your story that are just touch points for relatability, because relatability is really important. Again, the storytelling, the human connection, we all want to be able to understand and access the story. So that's something to think about from the very beginning. So that is also a little bit about commonality of experience. If they're not familiar with the scene or the people or the type of story you're going to tell, think about how you can bring them into that story as quickly and as efficiently and as powerfully as possible. That is really, when you're copywriting, you're trying to paint a word with pictures. So what are the emotive words? How could you capture the expressiveness of somebody's face? How can you use the power of language to bring somebody into the story, to what you're bearing witness to, or honoring the story of the person who's sharing their personal experience with you? So the number 3 storytelling tip is to think about your structure. So this is actually the point where we really start to think about the writing and how you're going to present the story. So purpose, again, if you're clear on your purpose, that is going to inform and guide the structure you use. For instance, if your purpose is simply making an announcement about your organization, that's a media release, potentially. So that's going to follow a structure that has an inverted pyramid where you're putting the most important information in your first paragraph. If you're telling a human interest story, you're going to have a little bit of a lead in before you get to potentially the kind of guts of the story. But here again, know your purpose. That will guide you how you're going to structure it. So in the traditional kind of storytelling genre, you're going to encounter the 3-act structure, which is what we see all the time with movies. It's not a complicated thing. It's really not rocket science. If you think back to your high school essays, it's about having a beginning, a middle, and an end. So typically, Act 1 is where you're setting the scene. You are introducing your protagonist or your lead characters. You're helping people see what you're seeing or kind of get a glimpse of the experience that your lead character has lived through and is about to share with them. So Act 2 is really the body of your story, and often this is where a story will live or die. If you have a very flabby middle section, you're going to lose readers, people will drop off, it can become very dry, it can become distorted by too many stats or too much unnecessary detail. So it is a bit of give and take in terms of seeing what's needed to be able to tell your story most effectively, but then being able to snip away the excess. That's redrafting. And the final act, Act 3, that's where the kicker is. So usually that's obviously in a conclusion where you're wrapping things up, you're tying up the ends in a satisfying way. You'll often hear people talk about a narrative arc, and that means that, again, it plays into the 3-act structure, but that's where your protagonist or your lead character basically goes on a journey. Sometimes people talk of the hero's journey. So at the start, they're living their life, they've got a problem, there's something that's happening to them that they're trying to make sense of. Throughout the story, they will travel through the middle of the story where everyone has the context and the understanding, and there'll be more challenges that come in there. And then by the third act, when everything's said and done, they will have been transformed in some way. So obviously, in the work that you're doing, that could be a huge personal transformation. It could be life-changing. For other people, it might be a realization, or it could be something more subtle. But if you think about that in telling your story, you need to be able to show some movement or some progress or some real change, and hopefully of the meaningful type, so that people can see how the work you're doing is changing things in a meaningful way for people or for the environment or whatever your cause area may be. Again, it's people. Some cautions, a couple of caveats with the 3-act structure. And the first one is writers often talk about throat clearing, and that's where you take an inordinate amount of time to get the story started. Don't waffle. Don't think you need to have 2 introductory paragraphs before you actually get to the beginning of your story. If you can, land your audience right there in the first paragraph. Bring people in with something that's really quite evocative, whether that is the language you use to sort of set the scene for how you're going to tell the story, what you're seeing, that you might be describing the place where you're interviewing this person. You could be describing the very difficult background that they've lived through, but get to your point and do it fast. People have really short attention spans these days, and there are just a gazillion stories floating around in the universe. If you want yours to be read, you need to cut to the chase and get into the action as quickly as you can. That said, you need to use the right amount of context. So it does need specifics. When you're speaking about somebody's life situation or experience, when you can bring in specifics, it really helps the story become a lot more authentic. So in that case too, be wary, use a judicious amount of stats. If you've got a lot of data to back up your story, place it in a way that doesn't distort or detract from the human story that you're unveiling there. So that's a balance. Sometimes you'll get it right, sometimes you'll get it wrong, but just try and experiment to make sure that everything is kind of pulling in the right direction for helping your story flow, rather than giving people the opportunity to disengage. All right, number 4, look for the human connection. This is the big one. This is why you're telling the story. Stories are the way humanity makes sense of the world. And so when you're looking for the human connection, I would say that is where you're really panning for gold, because this can be the make or break of your story. And sometimes when you're telling a story, the best thing you can do as a storyteller is get out of the way. So a lot of this comes down to the whole mantra of show, don't tell, which you may or may not have encountered. And there's a whole kind of lot of theories around what that really entails. But rather than telling your readers what to feel or how to think about a certain situation or about the story even that you're about to reveal to them or share with them, really it's about letting people think for themselves. It's a far more powerful communication method. So aligned with that is letting your interview subject sometimes speak for themselves as well. The last thing you want to do is sanitize their quotes and end up with a story that really just sounds like an organizational profile of what you're doing. You have to be able to integrate the quirks. Maybe it's the type of language they use, maybe it's a pause or a particular anecdote that they relate during the interview to you. Use that. That's really authentic, powerful stuff, because it could just be a really tiny throwaway line that actually is the clincher in terms of moving people, really bridging that connection between the word on the page or on the screen and the person who's actually shared their story. So that's why quotes are really important. Don't sanitize it. Find the human connection. It makes the story a lot more immediate and brings people in and keeps them there with the person. Just like a photo that really moves you, a lot of it comes down to the detail, which I know sounds a little bit contradictory, saying be careful of how much detail you put in there. But this could be, again, painting a picture with words. This could be just something that you glimpse in terms of perhaps the way they're fidgeting when they get to a certain part of their story. Clearly they're uncomfortable. It could be a little kid and the way they're cradling a toy. It could be the way somebody, has taken great care to iron their clothes. It speaks to their dignity. Find those little details and put it in, because that makes it a really far more engaging experience for your reader. Last point here, avoid jargon, avoid cliches, avoid technical, bureaucratic, avoid acronyms, avoid anything that is going to kill your story. And those types of words really will. It will disrupt your flow. People will think, I'm not even sure what you're talking about here. Be careful not to assume too much knowledge with your readers. You might throw around NGO as commonly as mud, but for other people, they may not know this. And that's, again, you're giving them the opportunity to disengage with your story. You don't want that. You want to make it as simple and as easy and as accessible for everybody as you can. So steer clear of all of that kind of stuff. On the other hand, use inclusive language. Use active language rather than passive language. Try and keep some energy with your word choices. Make sure you use gender neutral language. It's the 21st century after all. And the other thing that I would just say here is, when you're choosing your words to relay this, and I imagine it goes without saying for the majority of you in the work you're doing, be respectful. This person has entrusted their story to you. So you have a responsibility to honor that and, treat it with the respect it deserves. Number 5, the lucky last of my storytelling copywriting tips for you is to start. Some stories you will find are a lot easier to tell than others. Sometimes the people that you've interviewed or the kind of core components of the story that you've got to work with will make your job a lot easier than others. Sometimes it is really hard to extract great quotes from people or to get sufficient detail to be able to tell a powerful story. If all else fails and you're really trying to put words down and not getting anywhere, my best advice to you is write as you'd speak. If you need to read the story aloud, which is always a good idea, after you've written it, but if you're truly stuck at a point where you think, I don't know where to take this, how to go, if you were relating it to a friend who is sitting next to you, how would you tell it? How would you speak it? Just do that and then write it down. If you need to record yourself and then type it up, do that. But there is a way to find the words and put it together. You can always go back and review your word choices, change a paragraph, drop a whole section, but you can't do an edit without having the words down. So just do it. I know it's so easy to procrastinate on it or to get twisted up in knots, but don't go there. Just get it down. The other point I'd make here, particularly at this point in the process, is don't be afraid of feedback. In fact, I would suggest invite it. So not only from your colleagues or your stakeholders, whether that's at the time that the story is published, but I always think it's pretty good practice to send a copy of what you've written to your interviewee or the subject of your story. Because again, you've been entrusted with their story, so it's kind of a courtesy to let them know how you've interpreted that or how you've written it up. But also, it's an opportunity for them to point out any errors. It's really easy to miss a detail or to get a fact wrong. And if you go back to this person, they can actually make the story better sometimes they're not. You don't have to take on board every suggestion, but again, because you're treating the story with respect, you do want to hear what they have to say about it, particularly if you're recounting their lived experience. It's just the right thing to do. Sometimes, when it gets to the point of evaluating the success of your story, by all means, look at the numbers, whatever you can lay your hands on in terms of measuring the level of engagement that people have had with the story, whether that's kind of likes on social media or shares or the number of page views. That's really important. But beyond that, with storytelling, sometimes the attribution is really difficult when it comes to outcomes, but it's a lot easier most of the time to talk about that story's contribution to the outcome of your project, or, again, coming back to your purpose, did you hit your target or not? Use this to write better stories. Think about, again, the purpose, your audience, go through your structure. What would be the best way of presenting this particular story at this particular point in time to this particular group of people? Think about that. All of that knowledge means that you're going to get better and better at understanding how to present your stories in a really compelling way. And at the end of the day, there's no secret to it. The fact is, the more you write, the better you'll get. So thank you very much for sitting here and listening through this with me. Feel free to drop me a line with any questions. I would be happy to help you. And in the meantime, happy storytelling.